Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So welcome to the SCDM webinar on the implication for clinical trials on clinical data management concerning the crisis in Ukraine and in Russia. So it's my pleasure to welcome many of my peers today. What I would like to say as an opening is that the Pharma Leadership Forum wanted to quickly react and share with you thoughts and ideas on how to deal with the situation. So we are benefiting from the SCDM platform to webcast our thoughts and ideas. So it is thoughts and ideas. We're still forming our strategies, so it's preliminary. I think we're all learning from the situation, and we'd like also to learn from your own ideas and suggestions. So I'm Patrick Nadolny. I'm the clinical head of data management at Sanofi, and I will introduce my colleagues on the panel today. So maybe Bernd, do you want to start introducing yourself?
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, sure. I'm Bernd Heinrich. I'm heading the data management organization at Bayer.
Okay, so Demetris.
Hi, everyone. Demetris Zambas, head of data monitoring and management at Pfizer and proud ex-chair of SCDM.
So Simon.
Yes, Simon Trowell from GSK. I head the Quality, Capability and Risk Management Group. I feel a little bit of an imposter because I don't lead a data management function, but Mayank Anand, who's head of data strategy and management, asked me if I would stand in for him, unfortunately, because he was otherwise engaged. So lovely to be here.
Excellent. We have a few people not on camera, but on the call. So Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, thank you. Chris Lamplu, head of data management of Merck & Co. out of Rahway, New Jersey.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Sarah?
Sorry, Patrick, it's not Sarah. It's Andy Woodall, AstraZeneca's project strategy lead within data management.
Okay, thanks, Andy. And Nolene.
Hi, Nolene Turner, Specialty Medicine Data Management from GSK.
Thanks, Nolene. So welcome everybody to the webinar. And so I will start. Asking a few questions to our panelists. In the meantime, you should feel free to ask any question you have in the chat box. So we'll be answering them as we receive them. So they will be communicated to me. But to start and kick off the webinar, so I'd like to ask Bernd the first question. So we have all been through the COVID crisis, which we know is still present today. And the question to you, Bernd, is based on what we have learned on the COVID crisis, how do you feel you were prepared to manage this crisis in Ukraine and Russia? And what do you think the similarities and differences are?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. While, like many others, all of us, I guess, we're not prepared personally for such a situation. I've recognized that parts of the organization, specifically the Ukrainian organization, the regional organization, started preparing 2 to 3 weeks already before, actually the 24th of February, where I got a call and I was asked, so how can we do data entry into EDC if the internet is not there? So there was some sort of mental preparedness for the unexpected, unpredictable thing to happen, and then it happened. And certainly the first reaction was that with the COVID situation, we have learned a lot. We have written many guidance documents, and the initial response was maybe those are the right ones that we would need now. And certainly there are a couple of common things in place here when we think of visits that cannot take place, procedures that cannot take place, certain things that don't happen according to the protocol, which is a common aspect, let's say, where we were prepared for from a guidance perspective. And also logistical problems in general were certainly kind of part of the COVID situation. Now, the fundamental difference, of course, is that based on the COVID situation, we have gone extremely virtual. It was an extreme push to the DCT context, into the DCT context. And now with the current situation, that is absolutely different and not an option for us to mitigate some of the situations. But what is driving a lot of discussion for us currently is certainly the loss of source data as a situation that is different from what we experienced in COVID quite a bit. That probably handing over to next.
Okay, no, very good. You're right about the concern about the loss of the data source and the not such applicability of DCT. So maybe Chris, do you want to add anything to what Bernd shared?
Thank you so much, Patrick. First of all, I just want to say that, obviously our hearts and as a collective group, our hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to all of our collective colleagues and patients and partners and sites, and indeed all of the people of the Ukraine in this situation. That being said, I think Bernd really had a very, very excellent response. I think, when we looked at it, we kind of looked at it in a different perspective from the pandemic in that obviously there were safety concerns about patients and our personnel all over the world in COVID. Certainly this was very localized and it did take on another aspect in the fact that this was an invasion, this was a war. And so we immediately looked at thinking about, could entry happen? Could we get labs? Could we get samples? And as the situation unfolded, it became very clear that we were not going to be able to do much of any of that. We had some sites still entering data in the Ukraine that may not be as impacted as other areas. But for the most part, we are looking at, that data as really lost data, right? That we will not recover. So I think there are some similarities to it, and there's certainly some differences based on the sad uniqueness of the situation in the Ukraine.
No, absolutely. So, no thanks, Chris. Demetris, do you want to add anything to the
I think I have to start with the initial message from Chris in communicating and relaying our support for everyone impacted in this horrible crisis. But with regards to the impact here and the difference, I think, the pandemic was so widespread. This is a lot more localized, but yet a lot more extreme. To Chris's point, this isn't about waiting and getting the data later. And to Bernd's point, this is about pretty much concluding certain source documents are gone. They won't be recovered. So it had its similarities. I think we did learn some lessons with the pandemic that we maybe overreacted with guidances. Most of them were still available to refer to, but I think in this case, we had a lot more focused clarifying documents as opposed to guidance documents. Really where the most significant points were teams approaching critical deliverables and deciding, what do I do? Do I decide they're lost to follow up? How do I handle it? So a lot more limited and focused on some specific scenarios.
Okay, no, thanks, Demetris. And what I will add myself, you're right on the similarities. So same concern about the potential missing data, missing source, inability also, if you consider with COVID-19, inability for the monitor in the war zone to go to the site. So some similarities. On some additional differences, I could see that some of the patients might have migrated out of those war zones. So we will likely be losing patients within our studies. So it's not like some of the patients with COVID have been confined home and we knew we could reach out to them, as you said, Bernd, with DCT and other methodologies. But here we might have displaced patients that we might not be able to reach anymore. And how do you manage those lost patients? And how do you maintain their safety when you don't necessarily know where they're at? So those considerations needs to be taken too. So I will open maybe to the other panelists, maybe as Simon, Nolin, Andy, anything you'd like to add? on those similarities and differences with COVID in that question?
I think very aligned with the comments we've already heard from the rest of the panel. I think the biggest similarity has been in terms of the ability to use some of the ways of working and guidances that were developed through COVID. I think we've already heard examples of that, and we're certainly seeing that reuse with some slight modification of some of those ways of working. It does feel very different, though. I think the acute nature of the situation and really that need to focus on how do you assure the ongoing oversight, safety oversight of those patients who are already in the study. I don't think that was quite such a driving concern before, but here where investigators may not be available, the institutions may not be available, I think that has been the biggest driving force. It's been somewhat different this time. But they would be my comments.
Okay, nice. And Nalin, Andy, you want to add anything? If not, maybe I can move to the second question.
No.
Maybe.
Sorry, I was trying to find the mute button. Yeah, I'll just add to what Simon said. I think one of the differences that we've observed is that in COVID, you had to try to work out which regions were being impacted when in order to determine a sort of consistent approach for how to handle the data. And obviously the difference this time is it's fairly localized in one region, which does make it different in terms of how we make decisions about how to handle the data in the database.
Totally fair, absolutely. I will move to the next question, and maybe this time I'll start with Chris. And it is, what were your top priorities in formulating a response to the situation?
Thanks, Patrick. It's a great question. We took a very patient-centric and patient-first approach. That included really looking at the impacted studies in the region and our ability to conduct those trials in good faith. And that's where it started. And we then looked at, how we could continue at all costs to keep patients on treatment. And then I think really then the flow down really looked at how do we transfer those patients then, right? So we kind of looked at a flow down of patient care that we wanted to maintain, for our trials. Sadly, we can't do that on every trial for every patient, but that was our first priority.
Absolutely. Demetris, do you want to add anything to the
Yeah, absolutely. Continuation of, and especially for indications that are life-threatening, right? Yeah, maybe not as much for a dermatitis study, but definitely for an oncology study. And it almost goes without saying, and I'm sure everyone on this call, our own staff too, on the ground, making sure that we're in safe places and really acquiring any data is not worth risking someone's life to go drive to a center. We definitely followed a similar decision tree where, the employees, the patients, the supplies to support those patients, and data and things like that came down the list.
Yeah. No, you're right. It goes without saying that the safety of the patient, the site staff, our own staff was the first priority, and the utmost priority. Obviously, Bernd, on your side, anything you like to, on your top priorities, addressing the situation?
Yeah, certainly very much along the same lines. And I think sometimes it was a bit difficult to differentiate the two dimensions that Demetris just mentioned, that it's kind of mingled between the taking care of the patient safety as a focus, at the same time, quickly leading into discussion about the data. And that's something important to separate and to make sure, do we know where the patients are? Do we know, are they safe? What is going on at the sites? Do we have access to IMP? How can that go? What if not, etc. Those are the questions that were priority or are priority still in many ways. And also, as this is a very dynamic situation with an impact spreading, let's say, that's an ongoing activity, and still the data topic a little bit in the lower end here of the priority list.
Okay, sounds good. So maybe Simon, you want to add anything to the top priority?
Anything really to add, Patrick? Exactly the same top priorities as you might expect. So.
Okay, so maybe I should probably switch gear a tiny bit on I'll start by Demetris. We know that there could be different way of responding depending on the situation. What I mean is on the countries in the direct conflict zone versus the surrounding countries, we could approach the situations differently. So, Demetris, do you have any suggestion how we could have approached and we're approaching those differences between being in the war zone and being into the surrounding neighborhood countries?
Well, obviously, some of the in the direct conflict zone, some of it becomes reactionary, whether communications are present or lost. Early on, if you recall, when this whole crisis began, when the war started and the invasion began, there were cybersecurity concerns, right? So then you immediately take action in the sense of what access you allow to your network and to your systems from which locations. Obviously, that's going to be different in where the conflict is active, as opposed to planning and mitigating the risk if it expands, how you would react in additional geographies. And based on having just done it, then you're a little more well informed in what you may need or not need to do elsewhere. Then the communications, I would say, obviously the supplies is a very big deal. The ability to get supplies in neighboring zones versus in the direct war zone. The communications to our offices and our sites in the neighboring countries to be ready to receive displaced subjects, and then of course in the Ukraine itself, the Ukraine Health Authority has asked that they plead for support to relocate subjects into new sites in neighboring countries, but at the same time want to be informed when it happens. So that's, again, sticking with the concept of the communications related to transferring subjects and getting the supplies to the right place. Those were definitely the initial priority and communications and differences between the direct conflict and the neighboring zones.
No, yeah, it's totally fair. Yes, and considering the displacement of the patient, yes, is a big priority. So maybe, Nolin, do you want to add anything on that subject between the difference between the mitigation being in the direct war zone versus the neighborhood countries, or ND?
I think Simon might have more to add on this than myself from a GSK perspective. Maybe Simon, I could ask you to answer that one.
Sure. I think the responses are very similar to those of Demetris. I mean, I think we're looking obviously at the non-conflict zones at the moment. We are trying to plan, just as we were prior to the invasion, to increase investigation of medicinal product in depot and on the ground to get supplies for labs, kits, etc. in place. Really just anticipating a worst case scenario that there is some sort of spread over into other neighboring countries. I think as well a consideration has been those countries that are proximal to the Ukraine that are managing some of our company's humanitarian response. So looking to try and take pressure off of those organizations to the extent that we can. So it really is very, very similar points, but just trying to pre-plan as much as possible. And then obviously the support, we are seeing, an increase in requests for subject transfer between sites and just how to manage that as efficiently as possible, while obviously maintaining a very clear kind of custodianship of care between sites.
Okay, no, totally fair. So, Andy or Chris, you want to add anything to that topic?
No, we're generally doing the same. Trying to proactively mitigate the risks, make sure that the process is as efficient as possible.
Okay, and maybe I can add one dimension that we look into our organization, which is in the war zone itself. Not sites were treated equal, because when the crisis started, it was really on the border between the two countries, and we observed that the sites on the border were more impacted than the site close to the other country. So we quickly try to identify and contact the site to know which sites were still operational or could still collaborate with us, which sites were out of commission. And instead of trying to help everybody blindly, we try to help those ones what we knew could still operate and try to proactively anticipate the impact if they were to become unoperational in the context of patients transfer. So we have a list of the sites we can still contact and work with. And in our data management and communications, we prioritize those ones which we know can respond. It was one slight additional consideration for people to think about is because one site are gone, you have to assume, as you said at the beginning, the source data will be lost, the patients will be away. So, and we wanted to find impact on those kind of dimension.
Yeah.
So,
one more point. Oh, sorry, Chris, please.
No, go ahead, Demetris, please.
Say from the study, so we spoke about the risk to the subject and so on, but from the study side also, the active mitigation. So if you had to stop in an affected zone, obviously you're stopping recruitment, you're so on. In which case, if you weren't yet at your endpoint, you have to then actively open up new sites, new geographies. Whereas in the surrounding region, it was more a risk mitigation. Be prepared if needed to open up additional sites elsewhere and so on. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was actually going to say something very similar, Dimitri. We looked at the power of every trial in the impacted areas and looked at what does that mean, and quickly, are working through reallocation plans, for those impacted trials. I think that the neighboring sites, as everyone I think on the call indicated, were really about, preparing them for transfer, preparing them for how we can best, move as many patients as possible into those neighboring sites in a really expeditious way. I think the other thing we really looked at was how do we help in terms of, and I think we've probably all learned this lesson as well from COVID, but how do we provide triage teams that can answer the relative and important questions in a very timely manner to a lot of the clinical trial teams, right? So that we have really clear and concise communication around how to document different scenarios. And I think that was, again, something that we looked at with the neighboring sites and indeed with all of the trials themselves, because we didn't want this being handled, in multiple ways. We wanted to make sure that we were, providing that clear and concise guidance from a data management perspective.
Yeah. Okay, no, thank you. I see one interesting question on the chat. That at organization, we use a regional crisis, but it has not been well received by the sites in Ukraine. It is true that in the middle of the war, having people coming and asking you about data entry and queries probably is not the most appropriate approach, and we need to be mindful how we approach the site. I think, as we said from the beginning, the utmost priority is their safety of their families, the patients, the site personnel, our own company staff. So I think it is true that if we are pressurizing them in that context, it could be not perceived so positively. But I'm wondering if people on the panel have also observed some not so positive reaction from the site when we approach them for obtaining or seeking their support in such a situation.
Patrick, can I take a shot at that?
Sorry?
I'll take a shot at that because I couldn't agree more with that comment. I think, again, the safety of our people from our company, the site personnel and patients were first. And secondly, we understood that this was a completely different situation than COVID. In order to help, we immediately understood the implications to data as it related to the site and what the site was experiencing. And, we turned off escalations, right, immediately, right? We have automatic escalations for different data and different queries, et cetera. And understanding the situation, we turned them off very quickly into the into the event and into the crisis, and we continue to do that. We understand what they're going through and are trying to work, to understand their priorities, not our priorities.
Yeah.
So
I
I
think
benefit.
they're focusing on supplies, and if they're still able to maintain communications with subjects, because it is, when you're talking about a clinical trial, you still need to be able to communicate with subjects to ensure that you're at least from a safety perspective, you're staying aware of what's going on.
Yeah. No, actually, and I want to re-emphasize the point that for all of us, the priority is people and not data. And that has to be at the forefront on everybody's mind here on the sensitivity. And it was a very good question. Another interesting question, I think, and Dimitri, you might have partially answered it. And it was about if we have studies in startup mode into those regions, what has been your approach about terminating the study, stopping enrollment? So I don't know if one of you, or maybe I can start with you, Bernd, what was the approach in such a situation?
That was one of the first decisions we have taken to stop enrollment into studies in the region. And I think that's right way to go, and what we do, because we don't want to put anybody at risk here, knowingly that many of individuals are, right?
Yeah. And
there was a quick decision, an important decision, and that is what we continue here.
And to be honest, it was the same in our organization. I believe it will be the same in most organizations. Would there be anybody on the panel today that would have not stopped enrollment and would have a rationale for not doing so? I wouldn't expect so.
Now, the one challenge that we are faced, I'm sure you are too, is stopping new studies, stopping enrollment, but continuing ongoing. Is those scenarios where the ongoing are switching to a rollover, which includes ongoing therapy in oncology. Because the rollover in theory is a different study, but it's also the continuation of the same study. So we created this gray zone that we now have to deliberate and navigate our way out of, and I cannot say I have a clear answer to.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest challenge there is at some point IMP from my perspective, all right, getting drug to where it needs to be. I think that's, but other than that, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm trying to, there's a lot of questions coming through the chat, and I think it's very passionate, and a lot of the questions are around IMP and about patient transfer. And one of the panelists is, do any of the panelists have success about reconnecting, transferring patients to new sites when they have been displaced from Ukraine? So maybe if some of you have a good success story on how you were able to reach that seamless transfer to other sites.
Yeah, we have a few. I do not want to speak to specific studies and so on, just for many reasons. But we had. I mean, I'm going to give just one story of a child that was in a critical study that was displaced, and actually ended up in a country where we didn't have an active site, but managed to reach us, and we managed to have them travel to a neighboring country that had an active site and be transferred to that active site. So, even if it's just one or two, these are critical. We're talking about critical conditions, especially in a pediatric scenario. I think all of the work would have been worth it, even if all we had was that one.
Yeah, and I would suspect, and maybe the other panelists can weigh in, is many of our organizations have been provided patients with a calling number to call a hotline if they have been displaced, to be able to reach us, to be repositioned into other sites in the countries they have migrated to, right? I would say. Yes. And so maybe I'll continue to watch the questions, but maybe if we go back to the data management space, and maybe let's go about what we have done collectively to mitigate the impact on our clinical data. So maybe Bernd, if you don't mind, if I start with you, what have you done to mitigate the impact on missing data, the centralization of protocol deviation, the missed visit, etc. on your side?
Right. Yeah. I mean, Demetris mentioned already in the COVID situation, we wrote a lot of guidances where now we try to stick to simplistic approaches in the best case, trying to stick to the processes we have in place that are well documented and people can follow. And certainly then we have more protocol deviations, etc., where we want to make sure that we, in the analysis later on, we are able to identify the impact of this particular situation on the data, meaning that similar to what we did in COVID, discussing the prefix in the deviation text that allows us to figure out where the relation to this situation has been. But certainly there are many detailed questions of what we need to look at in terms of visits that do not take place, particular procedures that do not take place, source data verifications that cannot happen, source data that may get lost, etc. On these things we guide basically in the process existing with a little bit of a tweak. That's what we are rolling out, and then making sure that in the context of our blind review meetings, we have all the information at hand so that we can also engage with the study team and statistics then on how to read the data, how to analyze the data. But it's basically try to stick to the process, document where you deviate, bring that information together for the team to assess, and then draw conclusions from it for the particular study.
No, thanks, Don. So maybe anybody also on the call, so Nolin and Chris, you want to add anything?
Just something from us.
Please go ahead.
Sorry, please go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we've done largely what everybody else has done, but we've also put in place tolerance levels. So how much data has to be missing, and if it's missing, can you replace it? So do you move to different countries? Do you move to different sites? Just as a way of mitigating the risk to the overall study deliveries of the situation.
Okay, then it's a good idea.
Yeah, no, I think we're taking a very similar approach as Bernd indicated. We're trying to guide our triage teams, within our processes, and agree that again, the documentation of evidence that work that can't be completed or is going to be key, right? To understand around the procedures and data. And but I think we're trying to do that within the guidelines of our existing processes. As far as, again, what we look at from the data perspective for the team, we're doing that power analysis, understanding that, for instance, all future data from the Ukraine will be lost, right? We're just making that assumption. And moving forward with the reallocation as quickly as possible as to not to really disrupt timelines too much.
Yeah, very similar impact analysis, and really assuming, unless a subject was past the critical point in the trial where we had the endpoint, you have to assume that's never going to be regulatory grade. And actually, if folks haven't seen it, I'm not sure if it was yesterday or this morning, it came to my inbox this morning. The Czech Republic Health Authority actually issued some guidance on this. It was focused on helping subjects transfer to sites in the Czech Republic, but it also pretty much stated that if you're mixing data, you have to just assume from the Ukraine, you have to assume that particular subject is not going to be usable in that context any longer.
No, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so on the anything else, otherwise I can switch to the on the prioritization. So as we discussed quickly before, it's a lot of us have started to react, especially on the site in Ukraine, and considering the impact on the neighbor countries. And I know as an example, some of the COVID mitigations we applied right away to Ukraine, and we are monitoring the situation on the neighbor countries, and might decide to apply the similar practices for Georgia, Belarus, Russia, etc. So have you had similar approaches on how approaching the potential expansion, or how are you anticipating the impact on the neighbor countries? With any suggestions, Demetris, on your side on what you've been doing?
Well, about what I said earlier, I think the kind of the mitigations in those countries now is perhaps better informed based on the observing what happened, and I can't say that we have dramatically different plans. What was interesting is, we all have, I'm sure every one of you has these disaster recovery, crisis response plans. And some of them prove useful, like for instance, when there was a cybersecurity threat, that was an automatic, this is the reaction. But then when you get to the more real impacts to studies and more importantly to people, you kind of write the script as you go. So perhaps you have a more well-informed script now for potential expansion in the region. But I still think when the time comes, it's going to come down to what supplies are available locally, what communications are available to get to subjects, and so on. Yeah. And the rest takes backseat.
Demetri, I think I would agree with that. I think when it comes to cyber, there are certainly prescriptive actions that will happen at every company. If you remember a few years ago, Merck had a cyber event, and trust me, we never want to go through that again. So there are definitely some prescriptive activities that are happening as it relates to specifically in the region. We are looking at the cyber component from a perspective of do we have large data management presence in that area, and what would happen or what would occur to trigger a series of escalating actions from our cybersecurity teams, and how would that impact us? So we are absolutely keeping an eye on that and understanding the implications to that. I think as far as our business continuity plan, I think Demetri, you were right on. I mean, we have these plans in place, but we construct them loosely to be able to respond to varying events, right? We can't predict every event that we will see happen and transpire, but what we can do is ensure that the flexibility in those plans are such that we can respond in a coordinated and somewhat prescribed manner, at least until we understand the specifics. And then I think you'll see the drill down, as we all explained, around people, the supplies, data, et cetera. So I think the BCP plans are good, business continuity plans are good. And I think that again, we try to maintain them in the event of a lot of different scenarios. And sadly, this is a scenario that we didn't prepare for, but we're working as best we can for our colleagues and our patients in the Ukraine.
And actually, Chris, Demetri, this is a very good point, because one of the subsequent questions is we all have business continuity plan, having gone through the COVID on this crisis, which is totally different. We have been almost for the last 2 years in a crisis mode, and we seem to have different scenarios surfacing on a regular basis nowadays. And the question is, we have the reflection in our organization is, do we have resilient enough business continuity plans, or what do we need to think beyond our current BCP strategies? And did any of you in your organization are starting to rethink your approach to business continuity based on what we've seen in COVID and what we're now being facing in Ukraine?
Maybe you can give it a first shot. I wouldn't say that we have started rethinking things, but as soon as we got into the mode of let's look at the COVID guidance and let's try to tweak it, that it probably can be more generic and so on. I think that's the starting process that I see now, and that might make most sense eventually. But nothing systematic at this point. I think we're still in the mode of trying to mitigate what's happening now, but seeing while preparing the guidance that there is room for more generic and wider, more specific guidance eventually.
Yeah, I think
sorry, Demetris.
No, please.
So I think similar response to Bernd, really, that business continuity plan is it's a little bit more of an art maybe than a science. I think you try to make it as scientific as you can in terms of looking at the scenarios that are likely to occur. But similar to Chris's point, I don't think we have the level of granularity around this kind of event. Because I don't think we have the level of granularity around a global pandemic. We had diseases impacting the workforce, but not anticipating something perhaps on the scale that we saw. I think with these, it's obviously important to always be in a kind of a learning mode. We have after action reviews built into our process anyway. We've captured a number of learnings from the pandemic that I think we have been able to apply quite effectively in this scenario. And obviously, we'll look to do something similar. But it does seem like it's just building your knowledge base over time as new scenarios confront us.
Yeah, I used to say I think there's two categories here. There's the true kind of crisis management, disaster recovery, which to Chris's point earlier, there's some prescriptive things.
Yeah.
And then there's who has to be at the table to then manage the crisis. And I don't see that changing because every crisis is so unique. As it's a matter of, based on a category of a crisis, who needs to be at the table to kind of align on next steps and communications. Yeah. And then there's the guidelines side of things, where we're actually retiring almost all the guidelines that we created for the pandemic, because we've looked back at our core guidelines and say, what can we tweak, to Bernd's point, to make sure the flexibility is there, that we don't need a specific one. And then with this crisis now, we find a couple of weak links. Like, for instance, is there, even though we don't need a new process, is there enough clarification on the thought process for deciding someone is discontinued if you can't even speak to the site? Or the site itself, does it stay open? Do we formally document its closure? So there's a couple of things like that fell out and that we needed additional clarification on. But for the most part, I think our core guidance documents and SOPs were strengthened in the form of becoming more flexible coming out of the pandemic. Well, not coming out, but you know what I mean. We wish.
Demetri, I think that was, I think your one comment about who sits at the table is a really key observation. I think that was one thing that we learned through the evolution of our business continuity plans, is making sure that we do understand who has to be at the table to really make those rapid decisions and communicate clearly, right? We can't just communicate in a vacuum around data management. We need to understand our colleagues and supplies and the clinical folks and everybody, to make sure that we understand the situation correctly and communicate correctly. I think that there was, some probably, granular response to the pandemic that, again, if we could probably all collectively do it again, we probably wouldn't do it that way. And I think that's taught us some lessons, Patrick, as we move forward.
And also, I like what Nolin said earlier about what you also said about the localized versus global. When it was COVID, it was a similar response in every country, whereas this time is very specific depending on the region, which makes it to us a tiny bit more complicated, actually. There's one question which is probably very detailed, but we can generalize in some extent, is how would you handle a missing signature, PI signature? But I think that, as we discussed before, is if the patients are gone and we may not be able to connect to the patient, maybe the data is lost, period. It's maybe just a matter of documenting the loss of source and the loss of data in general. And it will apply to pending queries, pending entry, and everything. But do anyone want to share how they would document the potential loss of usefulness of the data for the patient's displayed site closed?
Yeah, I mean, it's already incorporated into our processes. So we define data as 3 levels.
Yeah.
As is, cleaned but not signed, and regulatory grade, which is cleaned and signed, or reconciled and signed. So obviously, depending on the scenario, it would fit one of those 3. Now, what goes into a submission is the one that has all those criteria.
No, it is fair. I think similarly, so we're looking at when you look at the data in those affected region, as you said it yourself, Demetris, earlier on, we look at the status of the patient who have completed the study or who have reached a critical endpoint to make a statistical decision. Those data are likely going to be usable within the submission, assuming we have a decent enough level of data quality and we have been able to do enough. But for those data where we have not reached the endpoint and where we have lost the source, yes, that data would be considered not usable for the statistical analysis and summation. And I think we should probably looking for enrolling additional patients when necessary to compensate for the loss.
That's actually an important clarification, which we've had a lot of discussions at various organizations when, people think the signature drops or disappears because something new happened. That's true, but if your system is part of a compliant, the signature is never really gone. So if you had that signature after the subject passed the critical endpoint, it doesn't mean you can't use that data. The data you're using was signed. It just means new data was added. And as simple and straightforward as that sounds, you'd be surprised how often that question comes up.
Yeah. Anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it also shines a light on the fact that it's more important to get PI signature during a trial and not wait till the end of the trial to capture it.
Absolutely, Nolene.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that is certainly something that is important, and I think that this scenario is certainly highlighting that. And agree, I think that we have to look at where is the data and to what extent was it signed, and allow the teams to make that utility conversation and decision along with regulatory authorities.
No, and it's a very good point. In general, we can generalize the statement that if we have an ongoing management of our data, or we review, sign our data as they are collected as quickly as possible. When an emergency like that happens, we could probably salvage all of those we have been able to review, sign on time. On the more backlog we pile, on the more risk of not being able to remediate in the future. I know we're reaching the last 10 minutes of the webinar, and I'm not seeing any new question, and maybe I will go into more on the remote monitoring. So I know we are monitoring the impact of the situation on our data. We might be using some of the statistical monitoring tool to detect potentially pattern or to assess the impact of the situation in our data. So can any one of you share what you have done to use your statistically based or remote based strategies to help managing and overseeing the impact on the clinical data through that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, we have the tools in place, right? From a central statistical monitoring perspective that has all the things that looks after eventually also misconduct, fraud, or whatever. And certainly in this context, we think that we need to look at particular countries a bit more closely eventually. But in general, it's existing processes that probably get a particular focus on particular segments of the database, I would say.
Yeah. And you're right. I think the same. We've been using the same methodology, but having a deeper look on the country by country, especially on the surrounding countries, and to see if we were perceiving any rising signal.
Well, remember Chris referenced earlier about those automatic escalations. Yeah. Obviously, in this case, right, the KRIs are all turning red. Yeah. Those automatic follow-ups and actions and escalations, I think is the last thing we should be doing to the sites that are, and who knows, some of these sites could be actually treating war wounded right now. The last thing they need to hear from us is about a delayed data entry in a dermatitis study. Right?
No, absolutely. As we said, Dimitri, first and foremost has always been the safety, and I think we should care more about the provisioning of the IMP for the patient with life-threatening illness, about the safety of the site. And I think the rest of it, to be honest, I'm assuming for the most part a lot of that data is lost anyway, and we have to do data replacement strategy, opening new sites in other regions, etc. And unfortunately, depending on the proportion of patients in the affected countries, as mentioned, if you have only a few patients in Ukraine, Russia, etc., neighbor countries, you might be able to not needing, because you might have enough statistical power to compensate for a few patients lost. But when you have too many patients in those regions, you have to anticipate that is no point if trying to salvage too far, and you have to basically recruit elsewhere. Sorry, Bernd, you wanted to say something?
No, all good. Thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think before I close, so anyone want to bring anything different? Because I'm not seeing any new questions, so I think maybe yes, on the local lab versus central lab. So did you change your strategy for the central lab versus the local lab? And maybe if yes, maybe in what circumstances and countries? Maybe.
I think, Patrick, we're looking at that particularly in Russia, right, as an opportunity to extend care for the patients in Russia. So, again, we haven't made that decision, but we're certainly looking at that, as an opportunity, because getting samples and labs in and out of Russia is very difficult.
Yeah.
That was one of the scenarios benefited from the pandemic, actually, where we had guidances that, kind of helping out with decisions on if the central lab sample is not feasible, then a local lab as an unscheduled scenario is better than nothing. Even if you can't use it for analysis, at least you can monitor the safety of the subject. Right?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a critical safety issue, then I think the investigator has to do what they have to do. And that may involve using a local laboratory. If we can retain a sample, freeze a sample for maybe later shipment to a central laboratory, that's great. That may not always be possible. But I mean, if it comes down to safety parameters, they need to do what is best for the patient.
No,
yeah, probably to add, I mean, it's coming back to the initial discussion, what is the priority? And here, from a patient safety perspective, I think that's the focus at this point for us, rather than trying to really fill a gap entirely.
Yeah. Okay, no, thank you. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming through the chat. So do anyone, so I know we have talked a lot of topic on the webinar. Do anyone of you want to bring something we might have not covered from your own perspective on the situation in the Eastern Europe?
I don't have anything more, but I do want to just say that, it's at times like this where you're just very proud to work in our industry, because our collective response as an industry has been overwhelming. Again, with an eye towards patients and our colleagues collectively who are impacted by this. So again, I think it's just that you're really proud to work in an industry that does something different and makes a difference in this world.
No, absolutely, and I was going to say that in the conclusion. By the way, I want sincerely to thank the Pharma Leadership Forum. I think we're all working closely together. I think we're all transparently sharing best practices and ideas. We all have in mind the benefits for the patients we care, doing what is right. And I think we should all be proud to helping each other out in such a situation. It was through the COVID-19 situation when we organize a webinar, we share best practices through the SCDM portal. And I think as the situation develops, and if needed, I'm sure we'll organize a follow-up webinar for the greater good of the pharmaceutical industry and the CDM community. So I want sincerely to thank you all for attending the panel today. I want to thank SCDM for giving us a platform to share our initial thoughts and ideas on the situation. Well, I'm not so. If we have missed any questions, we'll get back to you, but I don't think we missed too much. I hope you found that webinar informative. And as I said, as the situation developed, and if we see the need to organize a follow-up session, we will do so.